All right, Aron, Helen, should we jump in? Okay, great. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Shai Kaliansky. I'm a partner in the ESG and sustainability and both the social enterprise and impact investing groups here at Morrison and Foerster. It is great to be with you here today for the 24th episode of our monthly MoFo and BSR conversation series. And as someone who just got back from Climate Week, I can confirm two things. First, New Yorkers still walk really fast, faster than anyone else on the planet. And second, kind of related, the pace of climate action is finally starting to catch up. This year's Climate Week was one of the most energized and urgent I have seen in the years that I have been going. The conversations weren't just about what needs to get done, but increasingly about what's actually getting done, from scaling clean technologies to rethinking supply chains to embedding climate into the way capital is actually deployed. There was a clear focus on collaboration, and because we all recognize now that no one sector or actor can go it alone. And the partnerships forming across finance, technology, government, and civil society are creating real momentum for us, which we all acknowledge we really need. So that makes today's conversation especially timely. We're fortunate to be joined by Helen Clarkson, CEO of Climate Group. Helen is an experienced leader on international climate and humanitarian issues with over 20 years in government and corporate engagement. She is dedicated to advancing the transition to net zero through strategic collaborations and initiatives. Under her leadership, Climate Group has created coalitions of over 500 ambitious companies through initiatives such as RE100, EV100, 24/7 Carbon Free Coalition, Concrete Zero, and Steel Zero, which are crucial in sending demand signals to markets and policymakers to drive the energy transition, as well as building the Under 2 coalition of state and regional governments, and Climate Week New York City, a major event in the international climate agenda. In addition to leading the Climate Group, Helen sits on the board of the We Mean Business Coalition, as well as other boards. And now, over to Aron as well. Guiding today's conversation with Helen is someone who needs no introduction in the world of sustainable business. Aron Cramer, President and CEO of BSR. Notwithstanding that he needs no introduction, I'm still going to introduce him anyway. Aron is recognized globally as a preeminent authority on just and sustainable business. Under his leadership as President and CEO of BSR has grown substantially, advising senior executives from BSR's 300 member companies on the full spectrum of environmental, social, and governance issues. Throughout his career, Aron has served on advisory boards for CEOs at major organizations like AXA, Barrick Gold, Nike, SAP, Shell, and Marks and Spencer, as well as on the boards of We Mean Business Coalition and Rise. So with that, I'll hand it over to Aron to dive in with Helen on what we learned from Climate Week 2025, and more importantly, where we go from here. Over to you, Aron.
Great. Thank you, Shai. And I want to thank Morrison Foerster for its great partnership on this series. Helen, we never got to see each other actually in New York last week, so this is a good opportunity to connect, to debrief a little bit on what's going on, what was going on last week, and what you think the implications are. First, how many climate weeks have you attended? And this was, I think, number 16 for the climate
Yeah,
group. Is that accurate?
I think that's right. And I've been to 9 as CEO, and then one or two back in the day when I was living in New York, as an attendee. Yeah.
And for people who are just have just sort of clued into Climate Week more recently, it wasn't really such a big thing, and the Climate Group really was the organization that instigated it. So I don't want that to be lost to history because I think it's a huge contribution.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and as I say, I went back when I think back to when I went, Climate Group sort of put it on the calendar. We used to organize the opening ceremony and then a bit of sort of corralling the other events. But I remember when I was trying to host an event years ago and I said to Climate Group, well, how does this work? And they're like, we host an event, do it between these dates. And since I've joined, what we've tried to do is, we recognize it was an important moment in the calendar. People were starting to turn up. And so we've put a bit more of a kind of framework around it now. So we run the climate group events. We have the opening ceremonies. We always have done. We have a couple of days of what we call the Hub Live. So we've got this big venue, which, because people are running around New York so much, it is pretty convenient for people to know there's one spot where they can find each other. I think just to sort of rewind, in the first year that I did Climate Week, we came back and were like, oh, it's really hard to get people back into the opening ceremony after the break because they just want to talk to each other. And we're like, hang on, how do you make that a feature, not a bug? And so when we've looked for venues since then, it's like, where do you find a place where people really can come together and make that a feature of it? And then the other things we do are we run the website. Organizations can apply to us to affiliate and be an affiliate event. We give them branding that they can use. We sort of include some of them in our social media, and we sort of organize the events into streams. And so what you can do is on the website, you could click on food and only see the food events. And given that there were about 1,000 events registered this year or just over, that's
Amazing.
quite useful to know, what the shape of it is and just kind of find your kind of climate week. And then we do a lot of the work with the media, and, we set a theme out and we sort of say, look, this is what this is going to be about. And we try and coordinate with the City of New York, with the UN and others. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes there alongside the events that we're running.
Fantastic. I mean, I really do think it's one of those things which, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And so it occupies a really important place on the calendar. First, again, thank you for doing this because you had a very busy week last week. I hope you had a bit of rest over the weekend. You and I talked back in the spring about what Climate Week would be like given all of the many changes taking place, not least politically in the United States. So I want to start by asking you, was this year's Climate Week different? Was it impacted by that, by all those changes? How do you see that?
Yeah, in a way it wasn't different, but that itself was sort of it was still impacted, even though. So what I mean by that is, I think there's been a lot of over the course of the year, sort of like, well, is everyone going to be there? Are you like a lot of like, are you going to be there? Well, we'll be there if you're there. Da, da, da. And so we were sort of watching that play out and thinking about, well, the logistics for COP were quite hard. So I think that also sort of reminded everyone that, given everything else, it's still kind of easier to get a hotel room in New York for a start. I think there's a lot more to it than that and why people turned up. But actually, we announced the week before Climate Week. It was the biggest Climate Week ever. There was 1,000 events. Last year was 900. So it's kind of ticking upwards in terms of that scale. There are other metrics that we use. So, number of government ministers who come and speak at our events, that was bigger than previous years. Number of corporate sponsors, actually, that number went up. So companies that want to have their logo. And there was a point where I was sort of right at the beginning of the year, like, are we going to have this weird situation where we've got all these sponsors and we can't tell anyone? And I think that was the kind of impact. There was a sense of, in other years, it's maybe a bit more fight to be like, how big can I get my logo? This year, it's maybe, what is the pack? And am I in the pack? And what's everyone else doing? And so by the summer, I think we were saying, and I thought this, I was like, come July, everyone's going to get real FOMO. Like the people are saying, well, we're not going to go. We're starting to get FOMO. And then everyone came. So I think it was really good in the sense that it wasn't wildly different. I think we'll get on to the conversations, which were quite different. But it's more that the build-up has been has been different. But the actual event itself was gloriously similar, if not just bigger than previous years.
I mean, speaking as an American, I think it was hugely valuable for the world to show up in New York and demonstrate with their presence, with their engagement, all of that. There's been a lot of bad news this year with respect to climate. Let's be honest.
Well,
And
definitely. And I
it
did
was a
media
nice
last.
counter.
Yeah, and I did media last week, and I was saying, I'm not really one for prizes for turning up. I'm not a kind of like, well, you participated, well
Yeah.
done. But this year I was like, well done, everyone, you
Yeah.
came, because there was a moment when people were like, oh, not sure. And so I think it was really important for people to come to New York and say, this matters. This is a huge agenda. It matters to business, it matters to civil society, it matters to governments. And we're here and we're still working on this. And that was really, really important. And so, in that sense, I do think one difference was that the showing up was a thing in and of itself that is worth noting. And then you get onto the quality of what was said.
Hmm. So let's take on the changing policy environment, and not all certainly the U.S., but not only. Many people may have seen what I thought was an absolutely wonderful essay, bracing but wonderful, by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times 2 weeks ago about why political support for climate action has dissipated in many places, not only the U.S. I mean, you know very well, Helen, there's a raging debate over net zero in the UK right now, and
Mhm.
many other places as well. How did you see that different policy environment impact what you saw, what you heard, what people are doing based on what you experienced last week, or is it full steam ahead?
Yeah, again, some of it is, I think some of that debate is interesting, and I think we need to think about who's saying what and what
Mhm.
governments can say, what businesses can say, and what our job is as sort of, I'm looking at us as civil society leaders. Um, because one of the big sort of shifts, there is a kind of linguistic shift, right? And there's a lot of like, well, let's not talk about the climate. And actually, someone right in the start of the year said, are you going to rename it? I was like, no, we're not renaming. It's going to be Climate Week. It's really important. And I think, and I hear quite a lot, oh, look, you can do all of this in the absence of climate. You don't have to say climate, because you can talk about energy security, you can talk about air quality, you can talk about water quality. These are all important things. The sorts of things you do for climate are the sorts of things you do for all of those. So you could just do this whole thing without mentioning climate. And I think that for a lot of businesses, and I was definitely hearing last week, I mean, the NGO world will often loves to talk about narrative shift, which I've got an issue with. But you can definitely hear businesses saying, well, we're shifting our narrative. And someone said, I cannot go to my CFO and tell them I'm doing a nature thing. Like they're just going to kick it out. So everything has to have a really solid business case. So I think you're hearing from businesses, it's business case, business case, business case. I think it's really important that NGOs, civil society organizations do not drop the word climate, because one of the things that someone said to me again, not last week, it was a bit earlier in the year, was like, well, it's fine because people will see their insurance premium going up and they will know that that is climate change. And I'm like, well, they won't actually, because the media is telling them. So there was a big sort of download of all the articles about the LA wildfires and accounting up that was done. More articles talked about DEI policies, meaning there weren't enough fire trucks. I mean, totally made up, but like talked about that. Dan talked about climate change. That's really dangerous, because then you don't get the link between my insurance premium went up and climate. That means climate's happening. You get woke lefty policies are doing, so I think we've got to keep the narrative. We've got to keep calling it Climate Week. We've got to stand up and be a bit brave. But I understand that companies are in a different, I wish they weren't, but in a slightly different position. So what do you talk about? How do you talk about that? And how do you bring it back to business case? Sorry, going to start coughing now.
Well, your voice, I'm sure, was
It's
tested
holding
last
out. It
week.
just suddenly was giving on the.
Exactly. Your voice is saying, "Oh, I remember this marathon talkathon from last week." Look, my view on this is that it is, if you look at it from the perspective of a business, it's malpractice to ignore the various pressures and dynamics in the world right now, but equally, it's malpractice to overreact to that and to
Yeah,
assume that the current environment is going to be the environment forever. And look, it is ultimately about about climate change. And
yeah,
as someone whose home insurance premiums have doubled over the last 5 years here in California, where I live, looking out my window at an area that was ravaged by a wildfire 30 years ago. It is about climate, and I think you don't go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you're not well, but it's just an atmospheric thing. It's just you need to get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
My 2 cents anyway. Um, I think Shai alluded to this in his setup. Oh, and by the way, if you have questions for Helen, pop them in the Q&A. We'd be happy to take them either towards the end, or if they come in and they're in sync with the conversation we're in at the moment, we'll take them on then. Shai alluded to this question of commitments versus actions. How have you seen that dynamic change over the years?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think the era of not of commitments. I think commitments are holding on, but I think the era of get on the stage, make a big announcement, tell us how you're inspired by your grandchildren. I think that's over, but I think it needed to end anyway.
Yeah.
So not that it needed to end, but we needed to move on, and that's a lot to do with anyone who thinks about innovation. Things have got to get to scale, and we shouldn't be at the point now where we run the RE100 campaign.
So tell people what not everyone may know what that is.
Yeah, so I was going to say corporate commitment to renewable electricity. So companies commit to going 100% renewable electricity globally. 100% commitments are really important because, and I apologize, someone might have heard me saying this before, but if a company committed to a 95%, that would be really ambitious. Everyone in the company thinks they're in that 5% that doesn't have to do any different. So 100% commitments are and remain really, really important. But it shouldn't be a massive stage moment as it would have been at Climate Week, 10, 15 years ago when that was a leading thing to do. It needs to be, we're much more at scale now. So there's 440, I think, companies in that commitment. The more interesting, kind of in that sense, newer ones, steel and concrete, that's still something, it's a big thing to a company to commit to our Concrete Zero campaign, which is a commitment to zero carbon concrete by 2050, because we don't know quite how to do that. So commitments remain important, but one of the reasons that they are important and why we still want companies to join something like RE100 is because we have all the renewable technology we need. So the energy transition is well underway, but it's not done yet. And the things that need doing are policy change and sort of what I call the plumbing. Like, how do we get all the renewable electricity onto the grid? How do you go into a market, say, like South Korea, and actually change policy? And in order to do that, a group of corporate voices joining together and saying, we want to buy 100% renewable electricity, but we can't because this specific regulation is stopping solar panels going onto houses, which is a big thing in South Korea. You can't put solar on residential dwellings in most of the country, which is how the rest of the world that's had a solar boom has had it. So actually, like one policy we're specifically targeting in South Korea, you need that corporate commitment to get those companies showing up and being in the room. So implementation and commitments are still very much hand in hand, but it's much less about the kind of era of the big, as I say, big announcement, and much more about we're committed, we're getting on with this. How do we, again, collaborate? And the word I kept hearing last week, and I went to whole events and it was collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And I think that's a bit safety in numbers, but equally, I think it's where we are in the energy transition anyway. And companies being more sophisticated about these aren't competitive issues, these are collaborative issues. So I think in that sense, there has been a shift over time, but that is where we should be, given that what we're trying to do now is get everything up to scale. But interested in your take on that, because you work with an awful lot of businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really interesting and important point about how commitments and action are not, it's more of a yin yang. You need both as opposed to they're being in conflict with each other. I think you make a really, really good point. I mean, look, I think that there was a lot of exuberance 5 years ago, which was great, and I would say necessary but not sufficient. You talk about CEOs referencing their grandchildren. Had ChatGPT existed then, I would have thought that CEOs were saying, ChatGPT, write me a speech about our climate commitment, and it would have, produced something referencing, I was having dinner with my grandchildren. And
I know I couldn't. I was really running out of patience for those
yeah.
even before they stopped doing it. Yeah.
But I do think they're both there. I think for me, I think companies are more skittish about new commitments right now.
Mm.
And I think it's for a variety of reasons. I think some of it is something that I think is not good, which is simply a lack of a sense of urgency at a time when I think we do have many reasons, which I won't repeat here, for getting after it. But I also think quite legitimately, companies have learned over the last few years in the wake of these commits, they're really hard.
Mm.
They can be very expensive. There are a lot of dependencies and there are a lot of uncertainties. And the shining example is how are Microsoft and Google and others dealing with the power demands coming from compute power for AI. Now, I think you could make a case that they actually knew about that 7 years ago. But regardless, so I have both impatience and sympathy for companies that are saying we need to do this in a deliberate way and make sure that we're not getting so far out ahead. There's also a lot more enforcement of greenwashing claims now than there used to be. So that's another bit. So I think, I don't know, I think we sort of need to turn down the volume. And I think you're on this, alleged debate between ambition and delivery, because I agree with you. I think they should reinforce each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One leads to the other, hopefully.
Hopefully.
The other interesting thing is, we do a lot of work with Asian companies, and they've always, I mean, I'm really generalizing here, but there's always been a difference of opinion between a sort of Western model, which is, as I said, I'm really stereotyping, but it's like the Western thing is like, set a big commitment. We don't know how to get there. That's leadership. We're going to figure it out. And, it's led some really great companies over time. You lose a little bit when the CEO goes, or you get, we know those stories, but it has led to that kind of first leader thing. Whereas Asian companies typically much more want a path there before they commit to it. So the on-ramp is a lot longer, but then it's a deeper commitment when you get it. So, you've got to flex a bit anyways, that we live and work in a global economy, even if people don't like that. So, and I think that's been a good learning process, as all of us have looked out globally and said, right, how are we going to shift the whole world and not just assume it's Europe, then the US, and the rest, because Asia's going much faster now anyway.
Much faster and with much greater consistency.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that horrible thing and say, well, I was in Asia 2 months ago. I was. And you learn what you learn in 10 days, but the degree of constancy in some key locations in Asia was frankly quite reassuring in many ways.
Yeah.
So you mentioned collaboration, and I did want to talk a little bit about that. Collaboration always seems to me like the word that's easy to say and hard to do. What do you see are because you mentioned you had lots of businesses, lots of governments, lots of civil society, citizens groups, investors, you name it, the whole ecosystem is represented, innovators, technology innovators, the whole ecosystem is present in New York. Does collaboration look different than it did 5 years ago?
I don't know, actually. I think there's a real openness to talking about it. But as you say, how much is it discussion? Does it get out the starting blocks? I think you do see good examples, typically in a kind of third arena. So kind of like a policy, we've got kind of policy offshoots, say, of the campaign that I mentioned, RE100. So there's something called the Asia Clean Energy Coalition, which is a slightly different bunch, but brings them together. But those things do exist. So I think it's an evolving conversation. There's definitely a willingness, to share information with one another, which I'm seeing in a kind of, how did just the kind of pragmatic. So I think everyone's getting very pragmatic. I think that is pushing them towards people really opening up towards collaboration. I think you hear about success stories, and again, I'd love to hear your experience of this, much more kind of vertically, say up and down supply chains, where you've got a kind of a dominant, say, company at the top that's kind of pushing things down. Those kind of across a competitive landscape, it remains challenging. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the next few years if suddenly there's a push on kind of antitrust and all that kind of stuff. Because, I mean, we're all taking legal advice. People, these things are all done very much within a antitrust framework and with all that in mind. We're not naive to that, I'd say, as NGOs. We're in fact very cognizant of it. But whether that becomes a bit more spicy, I don't know.
Well, Morrison Foerster is well placed to address those legal questions. Certainly, there's a small plug, Shai. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there are a lot of great success stories, and I think the Under Two Coalition that the Climate Group leads on is a great example. I may ask you to talk a little bit about this in a moment. I think you're right about value chains. I think that the demise, more or less, of the financial services industry collaborations is interesting. I think some of the criticism and frankly attack has not been on the level. It's just been using legal arguments to stop something that people don't like, in my personal opinion. So it's more of a political thing. It's politics using law as a mechanism. That said, talking quietly with many people who've been involved in those, they will also say, you know what? These things served a catalytic purpose a few years ago, and that maybe that's as far as we should have gone anyway. And we don't really need it in the same way that we needed it. And again, I think there's some legitimacy to
Yeah,
that.
that's where I come back to. That's my question on that is that true? Sorry, it's definitely true they're saying that, but like to my point about the 100%, 95%, I don't know if we would have made as much progress as we
Yep.
have without the Paris Agreement, without those big things that Glasgow was very good, like putting like us really shoving the financial sector very hard. I had in my opening speech, I get lots of good statistics from the team and stuff that the top 6 Wall Street banks this year have reduced their funding of oil, coal, and gas. I just don't think that would have happened by 25% this year. And I think that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without those big pushes. So, yeah, I think it is a shame the demise of that finance stuff. I can see the argument of like, well, we're all now doing it anyway. I don't think we necessarily would have been without. I mean, you can't play the tape back in that sense, but I don't think the era of commitments was wrong. I think it's been really, really useful. And I think the question is, how do we continue to build on that and keep the momentum going and keep that flywheel turning, because it is turning. And then the other bit of it, which is really important, is how, and we were trying to bring this out at Climate Week, and I don't know if we did enough, but the competitive landscape is shifting so quickly with China, and it's hard to see from Europe how much that story is landing in the US. And I know companies are very aware of it, but like, how do we stay on top of that? I think is going to be a big question.
Just to be clear, I 100% agree with you that just taking the financial services sector, those alliances were hugely important in their catalytic sense, and more saying, well, at what point is that function played and other things needed. Anyway, say a little bit about the Under Two Coalition, because the Under Two Coalition has proven quite useful in the context of the US with, shall we just say, some starts and some stops on climate policy coming from Washington.
I will actually, also, I was rubbish at chemistry at school, but I do remember catalysts are supposed to disappear in the final
Exactly.
outcome. Yeah. There we go. A little bit of knowledge. Under Two is a coalition of subnational governments, so state and regional governments. So in the US, it's states. Canada, it's the provinces. Australia, state. It's particularly useful actually in federal countries where you've got a federal government that has a certain amount of powers, and then there'll be a lot of devolved powers to states. It's odd in somewhere like the UK where Scotland and Wales have devolved power. There's no English equivalent, so that's strange. But, around the world, there's often that layer of government that sits somewhere between the national government and cities, and has a lot of power, has the ability to implement, is closer to people, and often where actually a lot of economies are still regional. And so even at, a good example a few years ago, we had, I can't remember the exact stats now because I haven't looked at it, but Poland, for example, nationally, it was something like 5% of people worked in coal mining. So you've got a huge just transition problem there with 5%. It may have been slightly, but within a certain region, it was 45%, because that's a kind of, so state and regional governments have a lot of both problems, but also powers to solve it. And where it's often useful is in federal governments, where the federal government goes anti-climate. So it's not just the US where this happened, Australia famously, Brazil, and the US in and out. And then often what we can do with under two is use it as a platform to continue work. And so at the moment, you'll see California, we know, very active on climate, always has been, and continuing that. As we go into Brazil, the Brazilian states have been very active and under two over the last few years. And there's a high chance that COP goes to Australia next year. And we do a lot of work with South Australia. So there's also a level at which you can kind of continue those balls bouncing. Yeah, so it's been useful from a kind of policy. We also use it as a kind of incubator lab, like what can you learn from one another? So quite often we do projects where we did a project, on industry transition, and the person working on it in Minnesota met the person working on that in Wales. There was no one else, there were the two people, and they were like long lost. They find each other. We've been doing a project like that the last couple of years on climate finance. And like everyone else, is a huge topic. How do we access it? What are the abilities of states and regions to do green budgets, or how do they use, we're doing a project, we're just kind of kicking off looking at food procurement, because that level of government often will have hospitals, schools, and other kind of quite big procurement spends. How do you use that? Can you use it to shift diet? So if you kind of move over to a kind of climate friendly diet, which is typically plant forward, as it's called, not fully vegan, but like, majority plants, probably how most of California eats now I think about it. Can you use that to create those shifts and again create a demand signal, which is a lot of what we do.
It was really interesting to me. One of the themes that I heard over and over again last week was about local solutions. It came up in a variety of ways. So just a couple of illustrations. One is, energy that is, clean, secure, and local is something that resonates with a lot of people. And then probably the most interesting dialogue I was part of in all of last week was how to talk about climate with the political right. And it 15 people, heterodox views, really, really interesting. One of the leaders on the so-called eco-right, and this person who has a decent profile said, yes, there are 5 of us, but nonetheless, he was being facetious, saying, lead with adaptation, because it addresses people's real needs. As you talk about the Under Two Coalition, cities, states, provinces, etc. It takes it out of the ideological debate. It takes it out of, at least in the US, the culture war, and is about the security of your home, your life, the roads you need to get to work every day.
Jobs. Yeah.
Your job, exactly. And so I think that's where I think the Under Two Coalition in some ways has been very, very successful, but maybe even more needed than ever right now.
Yeah, I think the other thing is at that level of government, you can think about it, there's a bit less swinging that happens at that level. And so, I don't know when California was last Republican. I guess it was Arnold Schwarzenegger, was it?
Yeah.
Maybe. So it's a while ago, and you just tend to get a bit more consistency. So that longer term of policy making, which democracy really struggles with climate policy, we've said that a lot, is one of the big posers, I think. How do you do these things in such and then you've got to kind of get the bill passed in the first year. And, we saw it with Biden, you don't get all the money out of the door, then whereas states have that slightly longer. Now, there are other issues when you get states and federal governments, and this is, again, not just the US, but where you get that clash between the two, then you have tensions and those work out in different ways. And again, it can affect, but on the whole, you've got a different set of problems, but you've got a bit more consistency often and different levers to pull.
Well, speaking of swinging politics at the national level, you're British, you live in the UK. Most of the audience here, I think, is American or based in the US. Are you seeing, what should we make of the war over net zero in the UK? What does it portend? What is it?
Ah,
How should we understand it?
so it's a curate's egg. So on the one hand, do you want positive or negative first? Let's do positive first.
Okay, I'm all for that.
So Ed Miliband is and he spoke last week. By the way, people can watch a lot of this on catch up. And I interviewed Ed on stage, which was good fun. And the way that Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has gone about this is a kind of policy mechanism that I can't remember who invented it, but it's a mission approach. So you set out, here are my 5 big missions, and then you organize behind those. And his biggest one has been energy and sort of energy security and getting energy bills and down. We've been really exposed to European gas price rises post Russia invasion of Ukraine. And so they've put Ed Miliband in as Secretary of Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. They've created a whole thing around called Energy GB. They've created all that. So they've got these different structures that have come in and they're really going for it. And I was at an energy sector event a couple of weeks ago, and the energy sector is happy with what is happening. So you've got this kind of really good energy transition policy happening, and you can see that they are going for it, and that is popular. Or sorry, it should be popular is what I should say. So we'll come back to the negatives. So they're very competent, and there was just a big reshuffle. Don't need to go into the politics behind that, but Ed Miliband survived, which is great, and everyone's happy with that. And so on we go. So that's the positive stuff. The negative stuff is net zero as a phrase is demonized, and that's thank you US for that. And so a lot of time is wasted arguing about the semantics of something which is otherwise a very popular policy. If you look globally, and this includes the US, it's something like 89% of people want positive action on the climate. And they just had the Labour Party conference, an annual thing. And Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, didn't mention climate or energy. So this is an area which people deeply care about. They want the energy bills to go down. They're being successful, and she's not talking about it. She's like number 2 in government. And you're thinking, what is going on here? So I think it's one of those things where the politics of it are kind of going on one trajectory, even where the actual what's happening in the world is going in a much better direction. And they have not figured out how to just get behind it, because the far right, I should say, have so demonized net zero. They're afraid to talk about their success. And you think, well, how's this going to play out over 4 or 5 years? We could have up to 5 years. Are they ever going to grasp this narrative and figure out how to take something they're doing well and talk about it? And weirdly, even like last time we had a Labour government, one thing they're really awful at is telling you what they're doing well. That's, a bit part of being British, but it's writ large at the moment. So yeah, the actual policies and what's happening on the ground, great. Ability to shout about it, not great at all. But Ed Miliband was great at Climate Week. He said, we're not in the disaster avoidance business, we're in the better lives business. That's a direct quote. So he's going out with that kind of really positive message about energy security, all of that. He's right where you'd want a politician with that amount of power to be. But
so I know you say, yeah, well, look, what you just described is all too familiar here in the United States. I think you mentioned earlier, I was maybe inferring a little bit of fatigue with this whole debate over the so-called narrative. I've been saying all year, if we had a drinking game called Change the Narrative, I would have been passed out drunk by, early in the year, because I might
have had that level of tolerance in my 20s, but now, yeah, we wouldn't have lasted very long.
Exactly. But I do think there's an important point here. Did you hear anything last week that was either a light bulb moment where, a different way of framing? Because I think you're right. There is latent interest in the public, but it doesn't seem to be the animating either issue or theme. And what can we do to turn that?
Yeah, I think the next. I think we've got to crack this, and I haven't. You know, and maybe I'm guilty of standing on the sidelines, being annoyed with the conversation rather than jumping into it. I think one of my frustrations is the idea that there is the narrative,
Mm,
and I think that too often on the kind of progressive side of things, we spend a lot of time navel gazing and trying to like hone it, and you know just give people and we're so guilty of that. I'll show you one more graph. Like I'm just going to show you one more graph. This graph, it's going to blow your mind, and that's not where people are. And so actually what I think we need to do much more is get out and experiment and try different things and sort of throw a lot of mud at the wall and see what sticks. And I think that's what we've seen the right be so good at over the years. So I'm
drill,
using this
baby,
so
drill.
loosely, but like just keep throwing things and
Yeah,
then see what gets us all riled up, and then keep saying that over and over again. And why aren't we good at that? And I
yeah.
I just don't understand why there's clearly a playbook. Can't we have it? Like we must be able to get hold of it and just do it ourselves. But no, we just want another graph.
Yeah.
So that's my frustration. And
Yeah.
the idea of this a narrative. And I think what's interesting now is in a completely different way, watching Gavin Newsom just go back. Now, whether it's being successful, I don't know, but like he's trying something, like needling back, and so what's the equivalent of that on climate rather than a
Mhm.
kind of overarching narrative? And I've never really believed that there was one, but I feel like we've been saying since the 90s, the kind of there's one sort of super theory that will solve everything and
Right.
everyone will see our point of view. So yeah, I'd like us to be much more experimental and try and not be scared of failure. But that's easy to say, harder to do. We're all subject to the pressures everyone else is. So we have to figure that out, I think.
I think you make a really good point. Those of us who are interested in seeing more rapid action on climate, I do think we bring rational arguments to the table in a world that seems to respond to visceral images
Yeah.
and so on. And I think the point about not a single narrative is huge. The world is fragmented. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And so I think we all need to understand that there are multiple audiences responding to different stimuli and
Yeah.
realities and so on. The
And
unified,
that's why we can't be scared of saying that was climate change. That was climate
yeah,
change. Like
yeah,
when we see these pictures, let's not let these stories about woke fire departments
yeah,
take.
yeah,
It's climate change. It's
yeah,
getting hotter. Things are burning, and we can't dance around the term. And I think that's where I haven't seen civil society backing off it as much, but there's definitely fear out there, and I get it for corporates, but I think we just can't, in our positions do that. So how do we work through that, and how do we keep pointing the finger and saying this is a consequence? The solutions will lead to, better lives, but also protection and other ideas. And I've seen some kind of polling coming out on that, and that stuff does land. And I think we have to really lean into those things that we know lands, which are talking about people's families and
yeah,
what they love, and linking back to a place of love, I think.
yeah. Oh, that I'm tempted to end on that note, but I'm not going to.
She was
But I will.
positive.
Exactly. No, 100%. I will say we got about 15 minutes, a little less than that. So again, if you have a question, pop it into the Q&A. We haven't touched on technology. Technology, you can talk to techno utopians and techno dystopians on a whole range of things, certainly including climate. What did you hear last week on technology that caught your attention?
Well, look, the big discussion is around AI, as everyone's is, and I think obviously that you mentioned, what are these companies doing about their energy usage for AI, and that's very front of mind. Um, there's been some reporting out about the amount of energy we could save, or the demand we could reduce, I think is actually probably the better way around of saying it, if we smartly deploy AI in buildings, in supply chains, in essentially on the demand side. And I think that's got to be the next frontier. And I think we've got to move from that being, Google say that all the time, right? And they'll put it in their reports like AI, they've been pushing that message, and kind of think like, oh yeah, of course they're saying that, because of course they would. But we need to get in there and sort of look at that and understand, how do we unlock that? And so I think that conversation, I felt like that was starting a bit, albeit it's right that we need to keep focused on the energy use by AI. Someone said to me, it's not good energy if it's spent looking up cat memes, but if it's if we're actually then saving other energy demands in buildings. So that sort of popped out for me. Yeah, and then just continually reinforcing this point that on the energy side, we've got all the technology we need, and we need to deploy it and figure that out. And that seems to be a pervasive problem. In the UK, again, I go back to kind of good policy. One of the things that they've said is, so every country pretty much, it's generalized, lots of countries have a queue for renewable energy projects to get onto the grid. And the UK have said, well, we're not going to do it first come, first served. We're going to do it by what we need in 2030. And you're like, well, that seems really obvious, but it's sort of kind of a bit of a breakthrough. And I'm sure it's annoying if you're a company with a lovely project in that queue and they're like, we're bumping you back a bit. That's going to be annoying. But they've come at it much more from a what do we need point of view, not just a sort of ordering. So I think those sorts of solutions, which are about the enabling what sits around technology, are coming out. And I think that's where, again, we come back to that kind of collaboration, because you can get everyone on board with that approach, you'll get more buy-in.
Yeah, I mean, increased speed in permitting is actually one area where there is, without suggesting total and complete trust, but a sense of agreement between advocates for clean energy and the fossil fuel industry. Both would like to see the permitting processes streamlined, and I think the advocates of clean energy in the United States have said, we think, given the way things are going, if we sped up permitting for everyone, it would be to the advantage of clean energy, because there's more that can happen. But I think you make a super good point, which is everyone is so focused on AI, and it's really important, but the pipes are so important, and in many places they just aren't connected. They're not smart. There's a whole range of ways that, through a combination of technology and infrastructure, we could really speed the kind of progress that I think we want. And
yeah.
And,
my question back to you actually on this, on technology. So nature-based solutions has been a big focus of your work, more than ours. And I wonder if that, if I might ask you a question, like, how did that come out last week at Climate Week? Was there progress on that? Because that feels to me like the bit that's in danger, a bit that's in danger, with if companies are going to go so heavy on business model and everything has to have an ROI.
yeah.
We know that nature-based is maybe longer, but certainly, sorry, it wasn't nature-based solutions that someone said that to me. They're like, I can't go to my CFO with a biodiversity goal. So, I mean, I know those aren't exactly the same thing, but I'd be interested in the readout for nature from last week.
I maybe have a slightly more positive view of it. And for the events that BSR did last week, the first couple of days of the week in particular were focused a lot on climate and nature and the intersections there. And I think it can be hard to go to a CFO for a biodiversity goal. It's not hard to go to the CFO and say, we've got a problem with the water we need to run our facilities and in our supply chain, or we are seeing, we had one conversation where I started learning about the latitudes at which hops grow well and how that's changing. And of course, there's cocoa and coffee and all of these things. And what you get there is the intersection of climate and nature in ways that actually are business relevant. So I want to separate those kinds of questions where I think there's a lot of interest and a good bit of action and an easier pathway to demonstrating business relevance. Not in all industry sectors, but in many, and in different ways. I mean, I've always said a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. When you start talking about nature, it's a lot more granular. So I
Yeah.
think there is good momentum on that front. Nature-based solutions, however, as they relate to the achievement of net zero or carbon neutrality or whatever goal, that's a different story. And there, I think we're struggling and struggling with additionality, struggling with costs, struggling about credibility for all the reasons that I think a lot of people know. So on that one, I think it is a bit tricky, but I've seen a lot of increased uptake on the agenda to look at nature and climate through a single lens, and I think that's very positive. And it can enable the business case in ways that some of the other questions maybe can't.
Thank you. You said I was allowed to ask you a question, so
Yeah,
that's one
yeah.
of
Let me ask one more. I don't see anything in the Q&A. Let me ask one more, and then I invite you just to anything we didn't cover that you want to touch on. You referenced earlier, people are wondering about COP this year for logistical reasons as well as political reasons. I read today that Keir Starmer may, in fact, not be attending COP 30, which was interesting to see. So, anyway, personally, I think it's a good thing that the US government is not represented by its head of government right now. But in any event, how do you see COP? What should we expect? And what do you think of the COP process? Because I think the process in general, regardless of the availability of hotel rooms in Belém, the COP process is struggling a bit right now. What's your view of it?
Yeah, I think it's not regardless in the sense of like one of the problems this year has been that the logistics conversation has been so dominant that we can't even get onto the COP conversation. And
Yeah,
that's
I
kind
don't
of
know why I'm
that's
laughing, but yes.
yeah, I mean it's such an own goal.
Yeah.
This whole idea of a COP in the Amazon, great. But if people can't get there, and if you're excluding people from lower income countries because they haven't controlled the hotels, the price gouging, and the government says, well, it's not our fault the hotels have put the prices up. Yeah, it's your fault for choosing a city. It didn't have enough hotel. I literally did one day of economics when I trained to be an accountant, and we did the supply and demand graph. I could have told you this. So that's frustrating because what we need to get done at the COP is so much bigger, and everyone's been sucked into a conversation which is about, oh, I don't know where I'm going to sleep, or can I even get there? So a lot of us would go normally to the cottage if you're going, but normally I'd go for 4 or 5 days. I don't need to be there for 2 weeks, but the hotels are set up now that you can either go not at all or 2 weeks. So I think this is what's frustrating. So we're totally distracted from the fact that all the countries are submitting their NDCs late. I do think COP is in the category of things that if they didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. I think that if you look at the progress that we've made over 30 years of the UNFCCC existing and things like the Paris Agreement, we're way ahead of where we would have been. Not where we should be, but ahead. And so there needs to be a mechanism by which countries come together. I think, the UN have been saying for a while it's getting too big, and this wasn't the way to reduce the size because it's excluded the wrong people. So I think there needs to be a reset. The moment next year it goes back to Western Europe and other as the UN category. It looks like it'll go to Australia or Turkey. And hopefully that can be a bit of a moment of a reset, whichever of those hosts it, and we can, get it back to a more normal size, but get back to the kind of piece of the negotiation which are important, which at the moment are, are we getting a ratchet on ambition and how are we going to deliver on that?
We did get a question, so I'm going to ask you to try to answer it in
Quick.
brief. And it's not an easy one to answer in brief. I'm going to summarize this a long and very well constructed question. A lot of the action on climate hinges on financing, which in turn hinges on returns, but we have a system that prioritizes short-term value creation over longer term. How do we tackle that? Are we tackling that?
Correct. And I wrote an essay on this in 2009. Why discounted cash flow forecasting. So I trained as an accountant, and then as I did my master's and stuff, moved over into environmental. I was like, well, the whole problem we've got here, like I think this lies right at the heart of of the problem. And when I mentioned about democracy is a 4-year cycle, corporates are often quarterly, and we've just got this kind of lifespan thing. And that's why China is doing so well, because they don't have to worry about elections. Now, that leads us to very positive climate action with serious issues on, say, the human rights side and all the other things, and kind of transparency, all these problems we know. But there's a long-term vision there, which is the world's going to be constrained on carbon. We're going to make money off it. And so I think this is absolutely right. And we don't really have an answer on this, because every time it feels like as well we make progress and try and persuade, like we'll get, PepsiCo did a thing years ago where they were like, hey, judge us on the long term, and their share price went down. And she was, Indra Nooyi was the CEO, and she was horribly punished for it. So this is at the heart of the climate problem, but I wish I had a better answer than just, I know, and I've been writing about it for these 16 years.
Yeah. Helen, I always love talking with you when I get to see you in person, and today was fantastic virtually, and thanks to all who joined, and thanks for the great leadership. You really,
thank you.
We needed the anchor of Climate Week last week, and you delivered it. So thank you very much.
I still need to go back to bed, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Shai, back to you.
Aron, Helen, for such an insightful and forward-looking discussion. At the beginning, Helen, you said that we usually don't give points for showing up, but this year we might want to, and I totally agree. It was great to be together with those who want to look for solutions. And Aron, your comment about how those on the right, we got to talk to them a little bit differently to bring them along. I think that on its own, and Helen's point about the multiple narratives, those could be their episode on their own, right? There's so much to unpack there. So I guess with that, I'll segue and say, please be on the lookout for the announcement for our next episode, which is scheduled for the end of October. And thank you to everybody who joined us today.
Thank you.
Bye, all.